Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When Anakin Skywalker turned into Darth Vader, his former identity was more or less destroyed. The Sith Enforcer had become more machine than man, and whatever free will he had before was now replaced with a relentless devotion to serve the Emperor and his newly founded galactic empire. But certain traumas that Anakin Skywalker suffered through as a child would carry on to his new persona as a Sith Lord. And one of those traumas was his childhood as a slave on Tatooine. As much as the Sith Lord would try to suppress his past, the many horrors he suffered on that planet during his formative years would create a long-lasting impact on him. Now, in the canon comics, Darth Vader will eventually return to Tatooine, and he will confront Jabba the Hutt, one of the most prolific slavers in the Outer Rim territories. Today I want to examine why Darth Vader just doesn't simply murder him. Vader does not forgive or forget. He continues to hate Obi-Wan Kenobi for maiming him and turning Padme against him. He doesn't even forgive himself for what happened to his beloved wife. He also continues to hate sand, which of course is coarse and gets stuck inside of his air filters. There's something about Vader and his relentless pursuit for revenge that makes him so terrifying. During one of his first business trips back to Tatooine, Darth Vader decides to visit a random Tusken Raider village and proceeds to slaughter everyone there. The Tuskens were a primitive and superstitious lot, and one of the survivors of the incident would recount what happened at the village to the other Tusken tribes. The devastation was so great and the story was so terrifying that the Tusken Raiders believed that Darth Vader was a vengeful god. This actually leads the Tusken Raiders to build a giant effigy of Darth Vader, which they worshipped as a deity. Vader's lust for revenge was legendary. After all, the Tusken Raiders had killed his mother. But the Tusken Raiders weren't the only ones who tormented Anakin Skywalker. The whole reason he and his mom were placed in that terrible situation was because of the slavery that was rampant across the Outer Rim and on planets like Tatooine. Anakin Skywalker, during a mission to the Zygerian slave empire, would mention how similar the slave options there were to the ones in which his mother had been sold to the Hutts. Even though he was just a baby at the time, Anakin vividly remembers this experience, and he also remembers the name Garjula the Hutt. She was the one who ultimately lost him and his mom to a Targaryen named Watto in a pod racing bet. Slavery and his former masters would be a bitter memory that Anakin Skywalker would never forget. Now, in legend, shortly after the transition from the Republic to the Galactic Empire, Vader is contacted by some clones in the 501st Legion. They are concerned about their future job prospects and inform Vader that they have been tasked with transporting captured Nosarian civilians to a slave market on Orvax 4. To make matters worse, these slaves were younglings and females, and so instead of being added to the Imperial workforce, they would be sold for profit instead. Now, this is still pretty early on in Darth Vader's transformation, so Anakin Skywalker's spirit is still in there somewhere kicking it around. And I think seeing the Empire use slaves in such a terrible way really shakes Darth Vader's belief in the Empire. Here's a flashback to when he was just a child. At the time, he wanted to become a Jedi so that he could free all the slaves on Tatooine. Vader eventually confronts Darth Sidious about the Empire's use of slaves, and as usual, his master has an explanation. The Nosarians were former separatists, and instead of killing them, he was being merciful by sparing their lives and allowing them to give a positive contribution to the Empire. It's an explanation that, in my opinion, is not very convincing to Vader. And all throughout the Empire, it's very common for such excuses to be made justifying slavery. Some people would say that slavery existed during the Republic times, so why is it the Empire's fault that such a practice exists? In other cases, slave workforces were disguised as robot workforces. And fueling this slave trade were two great powers. One was the Zygerian slave empire that we mentioned before. They experienced a golden age with the rise of the empire. And second was the Hutt clans. Fast forward almost 2 decades later, and the Battle of Yavin leads to the catastrophic destruction of the Death Star. It's also very likely that Darth Vader knew that the Death Star was created mainly from slave labor. The destruction of the Death Star represented a huge loss in resources and manpower, something that would not be easily replaced. And so, for the first time in the Galactic Empire's history, they needed help from an outside force. And Palpatine had to look no further than Hutt space. Lying alongside the Mid-Rim, Hutt space was a massive territory encompassing worlds like Nal Hutta, Todaria, and Ryloth. Like many Outer Rim territories, Hutt space was always deemed to be too chaotic, too sparsely populated, and not really full of too many useful resources to actually conquer. The Empire's true power base had always been in the core worlds. Hutt space had always remained neutral in many conflicts that wrecked the galaxy, and it greatly profited from its position. And so during the Galactic Empire's reign, Hutt space didn't really see any major changes. It still remained a hub for, illicit black market trading, spice running, slavery, and all these other things that were deemed to be too uncivilized for the core worlds. The Empire even had dealings with the Hutts to run black site prisons. It was sort of like the Empire's version of Gitmo, but even worse. Vader had been waiting on Moon 1 for the Hutt envoys to arrive to negotiate the release of raw materials to the Empire. Moon 1 was located in the Corellian Industrial Cluster, and it was one of the major weapons manufacturing depots for the Empire. Like most operations in the Empire, it utilized a large Imperial workforce, also made of slaves. Slavery was everywhere. Darth Vader could not ignore this. En route, the Hutt envoy's ship had been hijacked by a group of rebels who went on to sabotage Moon 1, further hampering Imperial operations in the area. The destruction of the manufacturing base on top of the destruction of the Death Star put the Empire in an extremely precarious position. The Rebel Alliance had just scored its first major victory, and now their recruitment numbers had exploded. The Rebels were able to operate multiple resistance groups in different parts of the galaxy. There were even rumors that the Rebel Alliance was preparing a massive offensive against the Mid-Rim territories. Things were looking very grim for the Empire. Palpatine was furious about the destruction of his weapons depot and ends up sending Vader directly to see Jabba the Hutt and demand that they provide the Empire with whatever raw materials they needed to resupply their forces. The Empire had nationalized a great deal of mines and factories in the galaxy during the transition from the Republic to the Empire, but somehow it wasn't enough. The fact that they had to essentially beg the Hutts for resources shows us just how desperate and thinly spread they were at this point. Vader doesn't just see the Hutts as criminal scum, though. Their connection to slavery, and more personally his own past servitude, greatly offends him. Jabba the Hutt essentially replaces Gardulla the Hutt sometime around the invasion of Naboo, and clearly continues the slave trade as a part of his business portfolio. This is why when Darth Vader approaches Jabba's palace, he immediately begins killing his guards. There's no respect for them at all. These poor Gamorreans seem to just get massacred by everyone who walks through the gates, whether it's Fennec Shand or Luke Skywalker. I don't even understand what the point of them is. Now, the interesting thing here is that Darth Vader has actually arrived a day earlier than his planned visit to Jabba the Hutt, and that's because he's here for some personal reasons. But before we can figure out what that is, Jabba foolishly tries to take out Darth Vader with his own bounty hunters. The rebellion has placed a price on Vader's head, and as usual, the Hutts are looking to collect. Vader, of course, makes quick work of the rent-a-thugs and begins choking Jabba using the Force. This really should have been the end of the slug's life. Vader has killed for far less reasons, and with Jabba, he has plenty of reasons to end his life. We finally find out that Vader has come a day earlier to see Jabba the Hutt so that he can request the services of two of his bounty hunters. He wants one bounty hunter to track down Silo, an Imperial agent working for Palpatine, and the other bounty hunter, Boba Fett, was supposed to find Luke Skywalker. Vader has come a day earlier because he doesn't want his own personal business to be mixed with the Empire's official business. The next day, Vader will approach Jabba's palace again, and it's during this time he would negotiate for those raw materials that Jabba the Hutt will provide to the Empire in exchange for his life. So, one of the reasons why Vader spares Jabba the Hutt is clearly because Vader fears Palpatine. The Empire really does need those raw resources from Hutt space if it's going to bolster its military force and create a second Death Star. Vader's failure at Moon 1 has already put him in bad standing with the Emperor. But what's with these two bounty hunters? Why is Vader going behind Emperor Palpatine's back if he's terrified of him? Well, first he's curious about young Luke Skywalker because he destroyed the Death Star. Darth Vader had also briefly met him on Moon 1 as well. In the back of Vader's mind, he was already formulating a plan to train his own apprentice and take on Palpatine. The other bounty hunter that Vader secretly requested to track down Palpatine's agent Silo was a result of Vader's curiosity and perhaps jealousy that someone else could replace him as the Emperor's right-hand man. The reality is Darth Vader is not just some simple enforcer for Palpatine. This is the image he projects to almost everyone around him. You see, Anakin Skywalker never really died on Mustafar. Only the weak parts of him that got him in trouble died. Anakin was greatly scarred by his own actions both physically and mentally. The events surrounding the end of the Clone Wars were so terrible for Darth Vader that it actually made him mature greatly. You see, the old Anakin Skywalker might have murdered Jabba the Hutt right then and there when he sent his bounty hunters after him. The old Anakin Skywalker was honestly kind of an idiot and let his emotions guide him oftentimes into terrible situations. The new Anakin Skywalker, however, has a lot more patience and control over himself. As terrible as his childhood slavery experiences were, Vader understands that killing Jabba and getting a small bit of revenge will ultimately be meaningless and could potentially even doom him, because he needs Jabba the Hutt to be alive. First, so that he can accomplish his mission and satisfy Emperor Palpatine, but also because the Hutts are a third-party faction, one of the few that lies outside the control of the Empire. Darth Vader from the very beginning understands that Palpatine played him like a fool and was responsible for almost all of his suffering. But Vader hid this understanding very carefully from everyone, including himself, because of Palpatine's extremely powerful Force abilities and ability to perceive what other people are thinking. Any sign of disobedience would make Palpatine not trust Vader and probably would lead to Vader's death. And so Anakin Skywalker has gone from this hot-headed Jedi to a much more calculating Sith Lord who's mainly concerned with his own survival and, in the long run, revenge against the individual who wronged him the most, Palpatine. In this way, Vader has removed many of his emotional attachments, something that he really struggled to do when he was a Jedi. Ironically, as a Sith Lord, he finally understood how powerful and detrimental emotional attachments could be. Now, I don't know if Yoda, Qui-Gon Jinn, and Obi-Wan Kenobi are going to be impressed by Darth Vader's new development, but it just shows us how complicated of an individual he actually was. Ultimately, I believe that individuals who can walk on both sides of the Force and survive have a much greater understanding of what the Force is and become wiser individuals as a result. It is extremely ironic that it took Darth Vader going to the dark side, or Anakin Skywalker going to the dark side, to finally mellow him out and allow him to mature. Well, guys, let me know what you think about this in the comments section below. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.